She was flying while pregnant and tired, hoping to simply get home. But the captain of the plane humiliated her and even dared to hit her. He didn't know that Ronda Rousey was in the cabin, and in a matter of seconds, the entire plane saw how quickly the situation changed. Watch until the end and write in the comments where you are watching us from. Don't forget to subscribe. The steady hum of the airport seemed to stretch endlessly, a chorus of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements over the loudspeakers, and the muted shuffle of weary travelers making their way toward distant gates. For many passengers, it was the beginning of an adventure. For others, simply another journey in a long series of commutes. But for one woman, the flight would become something far greater than the sum of its parts. She was visibly pregnant, her belly rounding beneath the loose folds of a pale cardigan, her steps slow and deliberate as she moved through the crowd. Her face was pale, her lips pressed together in a weary line, and although she tried to maintain composure, each step betrayed the discomfort that rippled through her body. She looked like someone who needed quiet, comfort, and the gentle mercy of rest. But instead, she was bound for a cramped seat in the back of the plane, where she would be squeezed between armrests too narrow and surrounded by strangers who would not think twice about her discomfort. In contrast, the first-class cabin of the same plane radiated a different world entirely. There, wide seats waited with soft leather upholstery, glowing lights curved along the cabin ceiling in a comforting wash of gold, and attendants moved with the polished efficiency of a five-star hotel staff. Passengers with expensive watches and tailored jackets settled into their spacious cocoons, sipping pre-flight champagne while murmuring into phones and glancing occasionally at the boarding crowd with a mix of disinterest and silent judgment. The difference between classes was sharp, and those who crossed that invisible line rarely looked back. Among those settling in was Ronda Rousey, whose presence was far more understated than anyone might have expected. There were passengers who might have recognized her face, though she wore no signs of celebrity, no entourage, no loud declarations, no entourage trailing after her. She sat quietly in her assigned seat, wearing a casual jacket, jeans, and sneakers, her hair tied back in a practical knot. She seemed like any other traveler, though her strong frame and confident posture set her apart to those who paid attention. For Ronda, flights were simply part of the rhythm of life, moments of solitude between the relentless demands of appearances, training, and obligations. Yet she was not one to let herself sink entirely into the comfort of her seat without noticing the world around her. She had learned long ago that strength was meaningless if it was used only for oneself. As the final passengers trickled in, her eyes landed on the pregnant woman making her way down the aisle of economy. The woman clutched her boarding pass tightly, her other hand resting on the curve of her belly as if to steady herself. She gave a polite smile to those she passed, though many avoided her gaze, too caught up in adjusting luggage or jostling for overhead space. She lowered herself with difficulty into a narrow middle seat between two indifferent strangers, her body visibly stiff with discomfort. She shifted once, twice, but there was no relief. Her knees pressed against the seat ahead, her shoulders hunched inward, and her breath came in small, shallow waves. Ronda watched silently for a moment, her jaw tightening as she imagined what the long hours of flight would feel like for someone in that condition. It would not be a short journey, not a mere hop from one city to another. It was a transcontinental haul, the kind that tested even seasoned travelers. For this woman, heavily pregnant, it would be more than taxing. It would be punishing. Ronda thought of the times she had pushed herself past exhaustion in training, of the bruises, the strain, the endless demand to keep going when her body screamed for rest. She recognized the same quiet endurance in the woman's face and knew instinctively that it was not right. She stood, ignoring the curious glances of a few passengers in first class as she stepped into the aisle. With the casual ease of someone who had long ago shed any fear of standing out, she walked down toward the crowded rows of economy. The pregnant woman looked up in surprise when Ronda stopped at her seat. "Excuse me," Ronda said gently, her voice low but firm. "Would you like to take my place in first class?" For a moment the woman blinked, clearly caught off guard. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if she had not fully understood. The stranger beside her glanced up with mild annoyance. more concerned with keeping the armrest than with what was happening. The woman finally whispered, "No, no, that's too much. I couldn't possibly." But Rhonda shook her head, smiling with an ease that brooked no argument. "You can. I insist. You'll be far more comfortable there. I'll be fine here." The pregnant woman hesitated, her eyes glistening with emotion she tried to suppress. Thank you. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Rhonda replied softly. "That's enough." With quiet assistance, the woman gathered her small bag, and Rhonda helped her stand and walk down the aisle. Other passengers turned their heads, some whispering, some watching with surprise, a few with genuine admiration. Acts of kindness, especially in such a setting, were rare enough to draw attention. By the time they reached the first-class section, a hush had fallen across the nearby rows. Rhonda gestured toward her own seat, the plush leather chair waiting in the front row. The woman lowered herself slowly, her hand pressing against her back in relief as she sank into the generous space. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at Rhonda again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You don't know what this means." "It's no trouble," Rhonda answered, brushing it aside with the simplicity of someone who meant it. "Just rest. You'll need it." She gave a reassuring nod, then turned back to make her way into the economy cabin. A few passengers murmured words of approval as she passed. A young man whispered to his companion, "That's Ronda Rousey, isn't it? She just gave up her seat." Others frowned, perplexed at why anyone would willingly leave the comfort of first class for the cramped quarters of coach. But Rhonda moved without hesitation, finding an empty seat and sliding into it without fanfare. The atmosphere in the plane shifted in subtle ways. Some passengers sat a little straighter, perhaps inspired. Others tried to ignore what they had seen. Yet the image lingered. The contrast between generosity and selfish comfort had been etched into the memory of the cabin. The pregnant woman leaned back, her body finally able to breathe in the spacious seat. For the first time that day, her features softened with relief. She rested her hands gently on her belly, whispering words meant only for her unborn child. She did not know why fortune had placed her in this moment, nor why a stranger would make such a sacrifice, but she felt the weight of gratitude settle over her like a warm blanket. The flight attendants, though trained to maintain composure, exchanged glances with raised brows. They had seen many things in their years of service: impatience, greed, rudeness, entitlement. Rarely had they seen someone relinquish comfort for the sake of another. One attendant leaned slightly toward another and murmured, "Not something you see every day." The other replied with a quiet nod, though her eyes followed Rhonda with a trace of admiration. As the minutes ticked by, boarding concluded, the doors closed, and the plane prepared for departure. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, passengers adjusted themselves for the long hours ahead, and the sense of anticipation settled over the aircraft. The engines roared to life, a low rumble that vibrated through the seats, steady and powerful. The Boeing began its slow roll down the taxiway, preparing to leap into the sky. For now, everything seemed calm, the story nothing more than an unexpected act of kindness in the midst of routine travel. Yet the stage had been set, the characters placed in their roles. The world outside the windows was vast and indifferent, but inside the sealed metal cabin, something was already in motion. The pregnant woman, resting at last, closed her eyes and exhaled a shaky breath of relief. Rhonda, in her cramped new seat, folded her arms and leaned back, unbothered by the loss of comfort. She did not know yet that the flight would test far more than endurance. What had begun as a simple gesture of compassion would soon collide with arrogance, prejudice, and cruelty. A man whose power had gone unchecked for too long was waiting for his moment, and when it came, Rhonda's choice to step forward would matter more than anyone could have imagined. The flight was only beginning, but already the current had shifted, pulling everyone on board toward a confrontation that would shake the quiet air of the cabin and leave its mark far beyond the confines of the plane. The plane had risen into the night sky with a steady rhythm of power that only a great machine could produce, and the city lights fell away below until they became nothing but a scattering of tiny sparks, fragile and insignificant against the black canvas of the world. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had settled into that familiar mixture of routine and anticipation that came with long-haul flights. Passengers reclined their seats, attendants moved up and down the aisles with practiced efficiency, and a soft hum of conversation drifted through the air. In first class, the glow of warm lamps created an illusion of privacy, while in the crowded rows of economy, the dimmed lights and cramped quarters pressed people into uneasy closeness. The pregnant woman who had been given Ronda's seat leaned back against the plush leather, her body sinking gratefully into the comfort it offered. She had not felt such relief in weeks. The pressure on her lower back eased, her swollen legs could finally stretch, and for the first time since the journey had begun, she closed her eyes without the sharp edge of pain tugging at her nerves. She thought about the strange woman who had given up this comfort for her, a woman whose name she still did not know, but whose gesture had already left a mark she would never forget. Her hands rested protectively over her belly, and she whispered to her unborn child, telling them that kindness still existed in the world, that even in the most unlikely places, strangers could reveal a spark of humanity. In economy, Ronda adjusted herself in the narrow seat. The hard armrest pressed against her ribs. The man beside her was already asleep with his head leaning slightly toward her shoulder, and the space felt stifling after the wide openness she had just surrendered. But she did not care. She folded her arms, let her head tilt back against the stiff cushion, and closed her eyes for a moment. Discomfort was nothing new to her. Years of grueling training, fights that left her bruised and broken, endless travel schedules and restless nights had taught her to thrive in hardship. The decision she had made brought her peace, because she knew it mattered to someone else far more than it could ever matter to her. The flight attendants noticed. They were professionals, trained to maintain neutrality, but even they exchanged quiet glances as they served drinks and adjusted seatbelts. It was not every day that someone chose sacrifice over comfort, and in their line of work, they more often encountered complaints than compassion. One of them, a young woman with tired eyes, found herself stealing glances toward the economy row where Ronda now sat, her face calm and unreadable, and she felt an odd warmth of respect she could not voice aloud. For a while, everything remained peaceful. The engines droned, dinner service began, the passengers sank into books, screens, and silence. Yet beneath the surface, a shift had already begun. It arrived in the form of heavy footsteps, the sound distinct even against the muffled carpet of the first-class cabin. The cockpit door opened with a sharp hiss, and out stepped the captain. He was a man in his early 50s, his frame broad, his uniform perfectly pressed, his cap tucked under one arm as though he had stepped out to survey his domain. His face carried the kind of lines etched by years, not only of experience, but of arrogance. The faint sneer of someone who had been obeyed too often and questioned too little. His eyes moved across the first-class cabin with the casual ownership of a landlord checking his property, pausing on passengers as though weighing their worth. The attendants straightened when he appeared, their movements suddenly sharper, their smiles more strained. At first, no one paid him much attention. Some assumed he was merely stretching his legs. Others thought he had business with the crew. But then his gaze landed on the pregnant woman, seated in the very front where Ronda had once been, her figure relaxed at last in the comfort she so desperately needed. Something in his expression shifted, his mouth tightening, his eyes narrowing with a look that was more disdain than curiosity. He slowed his steps, came to a halt near her seat, and let his gaze sweep over her from head to toe with the air of a man passing judgment. The woman, sensing his presence, looked up with polite surprise. "Good evening, Captain," she said softly, as though expecting nothing more than a courteous nod. But instead of greeting her, he gave a short, cold laugh. "Interesting," he said in a voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Very interesting. I thought I knew the faces of everyone who belonged up here." The words were framed as idle observation, but the tone carried weight, and several passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. The woman frowned, not quite sure how to respond. She offered a small smile, hoping to diffuse whatever odd tension he had brought with him. "A kind passenger was generous enough to switch places with me," she explained gently. The captain arched an eyebrow, the corners of his lips curling upward in a mockery of amusement. A kind passenger, he repeated, as if the concept itself were absurd. So now we're handing out first-class seats like charity, are we? What's next, raffles, lotteries? He chuckled to himself, a hollow sound that held no real humor. The passengers closest to the exchange glanced at one another. Some looked away quickly, unwilling to be involved, while others frowned, sensing something off in the captain's words. The woman shifted in her seat, discomfort returning where moments before there had been peace. It was a thoughtful gesture, she tried again, her voice a little firmer. I didn't ask for it. The captain leaned slightly closer, his presence heavy, his voice carrying through the cabin. And yet here you are, taking advantage of another's generosity. Do you know what this section is for? It's for those who've earned it, people who pay, people who belong, not for... He let the words trail off, but the sneer remained, filling in the silence. A ripple of unease passed through the rows. A businessman glanced up from his laptop. A woman clutched her wineglass a little tighter, and the young man who had been discreetly recording earlier tilted his phone slightly, capturing the moment. The pregnant woman felt heat rise in her cheeks. She wanted to reply, to defend herself, but the weight of his authority pressed down on her like a hand around her throat. He was the captain, the one entrusted with their lives, the figure everyone instinctively respected or feared. To challenge him felt impossible. Still, she found her voice. I'm grateful for the kindness I've been shown, she said, her tone steady despite the quiver in her chest. And I am not taking advantage of anything. I'm simply sitting where I was asked to sit. The captain's smile vanished, replaced by something sharper, crueler. He straightened, letting his voice rise louder, ensuring more of the cabin could hear. First class used to mean something. Standards used to matter. Now we fill these seats with whoever happens to stumble in. What's the point of paying for exclusivity if anyone can just be invited? A nervous laugh from somewhere in the back attempted to bridge the tension, but it died quickly in the silence that followed. The woman lowered her eyes, shame pressing into her, though she had done nothing wrong. She held her belly instinctively, as though shielding her child from the hostility aimed at her. The flight attendants lingered at the edges, torn between protocol and instinct. They knew the captain's authority overshadowed their own, but their faces betrayed discomfort. One of them took a half step forward as if to intervene, then hesitated, retreating slightly under the captain's glare. From her seat in economy, Ronda had not yet seen what was happening, but the mood of the cabin shifted in a way that reached even to the back. Conversations hushed, the air felt charged, and whispers began to drift down the aisles. She lifted her head, her instincts sharpening. She recognized the tension of a confrontation even before she understood its cause. Back in first class, the captain leaned closer to the woman, his voice dropping, but not enough to mask the venom. You don't belong here, he said, and no matter who gave you that seat, you should have known better than to take it. The woman's breath caught, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the leather seat and vanish from the judgment bearing down on her. Around her, passengers shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke up. The weight of hierarchy held their tongues. And so the first shadow of conflict settled firmly across the cabin. What had begun as a quiet act of compassion was now transforming into something darker, something charged with power, prejudice, and cruelty. The pregnant woman who had felt safe at last was again a target, not for circumstance but for someone's need to assert dominance. The tension coiled tighter, a storm gathering within the sealed walls of the aircraft. And though the engines outside roared with steady power, inside the cabin the quiet was anything but peaceful. Rhonda's eyes narrowed as she caught fragments of what was happening. She saw the captain standing where he had no business to be, looming over the woman she had tried to protect. The unease in the passengers' faces told her enough. Something was wrong, and she knew instinctively that before long she would have to rise again. The plane soared higher into the night, but within its cabin, humanity revealed itself in stark contrast. Kindness met arrogance, compassion faced cruelty, and though the confrontation had only begun, its trajectory was already set toward collision. The tension that had first arrived like a whisper in the first-class cabin now spread outward until it weighed on every soul aboard. Even those in the rows behind, who could not quite see the captain's looming figure, sensed the unease. Conversations had dimmed, eyes shifted toward the front, and an almost imperceptible hush blanketed the passengers as though the very air had thickened. The captain stood with his arms crossed, his mouth curved in that mocking smile that seemed to mock not only the woman before him, but the idea of kindness itself. The pregnant woman sat stiffly in the seat that had been gifted to her, her shoulders tight, her breath shallow, and though she tried to maintain composure, the tremble of her lips betrayed the storm brewing within. It began with words sharpened like blades wrapped in the tone of authority. The captain spoke louder now, so all who cared to listen, and many who did not, would hear. He laughed as if what he said was harmless banter, but each remark was a calculated thrust. "You see," he announced, gesturing toward the woman, "this is what happens when standards disappear. This is what happens when we forget that first class is meant for those who earn it, who deserve it. Otherwise, why should any of us bother paying for it?" The man 2 seats down pretended to adjust his headphones, but couldn't quite mask the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. A woman sipping champagne froze mid-sip, the glass trembling slightly in her hand. No one spoke. The silence of passengers was not agreement, but fear, a fear sharpened by the knowledge that the man who spoke was the very one flying the plane. To cross him, to call him out, felt almost like tempting fate. The woman in the seat, whose heart had only moments ago been soothed by relief, felt humiliation crawl across her skin like fire. Her cheeks burned with the heat of shame, though she had done nothing wrong. She opened her mouth once, twice, trying to respond, but the weight of so many watching eyes and the sneer of the man towering above her smothered her words before they could form. Her hand instinctively pressed against her belly, a protective gesture as if shielding her unborn child from the cruelty now directed at her. Still she tried. "This seat was offered to me," she said quietly, though her voice quavered. "I did not ask for it. I would never." The captain cut her off with a bark of laughter. "Of course you didn't ask. People like you never do. You just take what you're given and pretend it's your right, sitting here as though you belong. Do you even know how much these tickets cost?" His tone was mocking, his words cruelly deliberate, each syllable meant to grind her dignity into the floor. The woman's eyes glistened, tears threatening to spill. She looked down, unable to meet his gaze any longer. The captain leaned closer, his voice dropping into something more venomous, for her alone, though it carried far enough for others to hear. "You should be grateful I don't send you back where you came from. You don't fool me. You don't belong here. Not for 1 second." A collective unease settled across the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, some looking away in shame, others with barely contained outrage they dared not express. The businessman who had been typing earlier closed his laptop and sat motionless, his jaw tight, while the young man with the phone angled it carefully to capture the moment, his hand trembling. The woman across the aisle covered her mouth, eyes wide, as if witnessing something indecent she could not look away from. The captain was not satisfied with words. Perhaps he sensed the silence of the cabin as submission. Perhaps he mistook the fear in their eyes for approval, but he pressed further, pushing the boundaries of cruelty. He straightened, then leaned down again, his shadow falling across the woman's face. His hand lifted, casual, dismissive, and before anyone could react, he gave her a light but unmistakable slap on the cheek. The sound was not loud. It was a mere snap of skin against skin, yet in the stillness of the cabin it rang like a gunshot. The pregnant woman flinched, a gasp tearing from her throat as she recoiled in shock. Her hand flew instinctively to her face, her eyes wide with disbelief. The entire first-class cabin froze, horror painted across their expressions. The humiliation was complete. Not only had he stripped her of dignity with words, but now he had laid hands on her, reducing her to an object of his contempt. The silence that followed was suffocating. Not a single passenger moved. A fork clattered softly against a plate somewhere in the back, the only sound breaking the unbearable stillness. The woman's tears spilled freely now, sliding down her cheeks as she trembled in her seat. She whispered something to herself, a broken fragment of words meant to calm her child. though her voice cracked under the weight of humiliation. The captain straightened, his face unreadable, though there was a glint in his eye that suggested satisfaction. He looked around at the watching passengers, as though daring them to speak, to challenge him, to contradict the authority he wielded. None did. The attendants at the end of the aisle looked stricken, frozen in place by fear of defying their superior. The young attendant who had earlier admired Ronda's gesture pressed her lips together, her eyes shining with tears she could not let fall. She wanted to step forward, to intervene, but her legs would not move. And still, the captain continued. "You see?" he said, his voice booming through the cabin. "This is what happens when people forget their place. Order must be maintained. Standards must be upheld. Otherwise, chaos takes hold, and anyone thinks they can just walk in and claim what is not theirs." His words, intended as a justification, fell flat against the horror in the passengers' eyes. For them, the mask had slipped. The man entrusted with their safety had revealed something cruel, something dangerous, something deeply wrong. From her seat in economy, Ronda had already been watching. She had felt the shift in the air, had heard fragments of the captain's words, and when she rose slightly to see over the seats ahead, the sight froze her in place for only a moment. The captain's hand lowering, the woman's face recoiling, the silent, stunned reaction of those around them, she understood instantly what had just happened. A muscle worked in her jaw. Her eyes hardened, her body straightened. She felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders, the knowledge that silence now would make her complicit. She had not given up her seat to see this woman degraded. She had not chosen sacrifice so cruelty could take its place. Something inside her, forged in years of combat, honed in the crucible of discipline and justice, refused to let the humiliation stand. The captain, oblivious to the storm he had awoken, lingered a moment longer, still basking in the silence he mistook for control. He did not notice the shift in the aisle behind him, the ripple of energy that traveled through the rows as Ronda rose from her cramped seat, her presence commanding even before she spoke a word. The silence that had followed the slap was heavy, unbearable, but it would not last much longer. The woman in the seat wiped at her tears, trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. For her, the world had closed in, the humiliation threatening to crush her. But she did not yet know that she was no longer alone, that the kindness she had received earlier was not the end of the story, but only the beginning. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. The captain stood smug in his assumed authority. The passengers sat paralyzed in fear, and the hum of the engines beyond the walls was the only reminder of the world outside. Yet within the pressurized chamber of that plane, the balance of power was about to shift. The humiliation, cruel and calculated, had reached its peak, and like all storms at their height, it was only moments away from breaking. The silence that followed the captain's slap was not just silence. It was a suffocating void that seemed to consume the entire cabin. The hum of the engines outside could not disguise the unnatural stillness within. People stared, some frozen in disbelief, others looking down at their laps as though pretending they had seen nothing, while others' eyes brimmed with outrage they dared not voice. The pregnant woman sat trembling, her cheeks still stinging, her tears sliding down with no effort to hide them now. She was too shocked, too humiliated to conceal her grief. The captain, meanwhile, stood upright again, his chest puffed, his chin high, radiating the confidence of a man who believed he had just reaffirmed his authority. It was in that unbearable stillness that movement broke the spell. At the back of the cabin, Ronda rose slowly from her cramped economy seat. She did not rush, did not storm forward. She moved with deliberate precision, her body unfolding like a shadow coming to life. Her head was held high, her jaw set, her shoulders squared in that unmistakable way of someone who had spent her life in combat, in confrontation, in places where strength was tested against arrogance time and again. The passengers nearest her noticed first. A murmur rippled, a shifting of eyes, and then the hush deepened as they saw who was coming down the aisle. The captain had not yet turned. He was still basking in the distorted pride of his act, still lecturing the cabin as though he were the guardian of some sacred order. Respect must be demanded, he was saying, his voice sharp and commanding. If we let anyone undermine the meaning of authority, what is left? Chaos, weakness, disorder. Rhonda's steps echoed against the hush, each one measured, steady, unhurried. She passed the rows of economy where people leaned back, eyes widening, some whispering to each other as recognition dawned. By the time she crossed into first class, the air was taut, electric. The captain finally noticed the shift when the murmurs behind him swelled. He turned, annoyance etched across his face, and froze when he saw her standing there. Rhonda's voice was calm, but it cut through the air with the precision of a blade. "That's enough." The word carried with it a finality, a command that did not need to be shouted. It had the weight of absolute conviction, the authority not of rank or title, but of presence. Passengers straightened unconsciously. Some exhaled, as though relieved someone had spoken the words they themselves could not. The captain blinked, his sneer faltering just for a heartbeat before returning in a mockery of confidence. "And who are you to tell me what's enough?" he asked, his voice dripping with derision. "This is my plane, my cabin, my authority. Sit down, miss, and mind your own business." Rhonda took a step closer. She was not smiling, nor was she frowning. Her face was carved from stone, her eyes locked on his, unwavering. "Your authority does not give you the right to humiliate or assault a passenger. She has done nothing wrong. You will apologize, and you will stop this right now." The captain laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, but there was a tremor beneath it that betrayed the crack forming in his confidence. He leaned toward her, using his height, his uniform, the power he thought still shielded him. "You think you can tell me how to do my job? You think because you've got a loud voice and a little attitude, you can challenge me here? Sit down or I'll make sure you regret standing up at all." Somewhere behind them, the young man's phone camera tilted higher, capturing every word, every movement. Passengers held their breath. The pregnant woman looked up through her tears, her eyes wide, watching the stranger who had already given her a seat now, stepping into a far greater battle on her behalf. Rhonda's lips moved, her words quiet, precise, laced with steel. "You just made your last threat." She moved when he did. The captain, in his arrogance, stepped forward, his hand shooting out toward her arm as though to grab and force her back into place. But he moved like a man who had always been obeyed, not like one trained in combat. Rhonda moved like a storm unleashed. Her hand snapped upward, deflecting his grasp with effortless precision. Her other arm coiled around his wrist, twisting it in a direction it was never meant to go, her body pivoting with such controlled grace that in a single heartbeat his balance was gone. Gasps rippled through the cabin as the captain was wrenched forward, his arm locked, his body bent in a painful arc he could not resist. Rhonda flowed into the motion, her hips turning, her stance unbreakable. In a smooth, inevitable sweep, she threw him across her shoulder. The weight of him, broad, uniformed, proud, slammed into the carpet with a heavy thud that vibrated through the first-class cabin. He let out a strangled cry, not of anger but of shock, his breath stolen by the force of his fall. Passengers erupted in murmurs, gasps, even cries of disbelief. A woman clapped a hand over her mouth, a businessman whispered, "My God," under his breath. The attendants stared, frozen, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. Rhonda did not let go. She crouched over him, her knee pressing firmly into his shoulder blade, her grip unyielding as she pinned his arm in a lock that left him utterly powerless. His face, once filled with arrogance, was now flushed with pain and disbelief. He struggled, but the futility of it was evident. She controlled him with the ease of a predator holding prey, with the precision of someone who had mastered the art of restraint. Her voice carried again, steady, unwavering for all to hear. "This man is not fit to command respect. He is a bully. He struck a woman who could not fight back, believing no one would stop him. But he was wrong. You want to talk about order, about standards? Then understand this. Respect is not taken by force. It is earned by how you treat others. And tonight, you've lost it." A ripple of applause began, tentative at first, then swelling as passengers found their courage. Hands clapped, voices rose, and the quiet cabin that had moments ago been suffocated by fear now shook with approval. The captain writhed once more, humiliated by the sound, but he could not move. Rhonda leaned closer. Her words meant only for him, though everyone strained to hear. If you ever raise your hand against another passenger again, if you ever use your position to prey on the vulnerable, you'll answer for it. Tonight, you answer to me. The captain let out a groan, a mixture of pain and anger, but no words followed. He had nothing left. His authority had crumbled in the face of someone who neither feared his uniform nor cared for his title. The attendants finally moved, rushing forward with hesitance, as though approaching a wild animal. One of them, the young woman who had earlier admired Rhonda's kindness, stepped closer. Her hands shook, but her voice steadied as she said, We'll take it from here." Rhonda released her grip only when she was certain the man was subdued. She rose with calm dignity, her movements controlled, her face still carved with resolve. She adjusted her jacket, her eyes sweeping across the passengers, meeting their gazes one by one, reassuring them that the danger had passed. The captain lay on the floor, clutching his arm, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. The applause swelled again, passengers emboldened by what they had seen. Some shouted words of support, others simply clapped until their hands hurt. The pregnant woman sobbed openly now, but these were not tears of shame. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something far greater than herself. She pressed a hand to her cheek where the slap still burned, and the other to her belly, whispering words of comfort to her child. Her eyes locked on Rhonda, and in that gaze was everything she could not say aloud. Thank you. Thank you for standing where no one else dared. The plane itself seemed to breathe again, the weight of fear lifting. The storm that had gathered in silence had finally broken, and in its place came the roar of justice. Rhonda stood tall, her figure framed by the dim glow of cabin lights. Not as a celebrity, not as an athlete, but as something greater in that moment. She was the defender the woman had needed, the one who would not allow cruelty to go unanswered. And though the confrontation was over, the consequences had only just begun. The passengers knew it, the attendants knew it, and even the captain, humiliated and broken on the floor, knew it. What had been unleashed in that cabin could not be undone. The engines outside roared on, steady as ever, but inside the cabin the order of things had changed. Fear no longer reigned, silence no longer suffocated. The balance of power had shifted, and though the journey was far from over, its course had already been altered forever. The cabin remained charged with the echo of what had just transpired. The sight of the captain sprawled on the carpet, subdued and stripped of the authority he had flaunted moments before, lingered in the minds of every passenger like the aftershock of a storm. The applause still buzzed in the air, though it had softened into murmurs, a collective disbelief that what they had just witnessed was real. For a long moment no one moved, as though afraid to break the fragile new order that had been forged in the confrontation. Rhonda stood in the aisle, her posture calm but unyielding, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, her eyes sweeping over the stunned faces before her. She had not acted for applause, and she did not bask in it now. Her concern was still fixed on the woman she had defended, who sat trembling in her seat, one hand to her cheek and the other on her belly, her wide eyes brimming with gratitude and disbelief. The attendants, shaken and hesitant, finally found their voices. The young woman who had earlier admired Rhonda's compassion bent down toward the captain, speaking in a hurried whisper. Her words were meant for him, but the strain in her voice was evident to everyone nearby. "You need to stay down, Captain. We'll handle this now." She glanced nervously toward Rhonda, and for the first time there was no fear of reprimand in her eyes, only respect and a quiet plea for guidance. Two other attendants crouched beside the captain, though their hands shook as they reached for him, uncertain whether to treat him as their superior or their responsibility. The captain, red-faced and gasping, tried to wrench himself upright, but his body betrayed him. The humiliation of his fall, the pain in his shoulder, and the iron memory of Rhonda's hold combined to weaken him. His voice cracked as he barked, "Get your hands off me! I am the captain of this aircraft." But the words no longer carried the weight they once had. They sounded pitiful, hollow, almost desperate. The passengers who heard them exchanged glances, no longer cowering under his authority, but openly acknowledging the absurdity of his claim to dignity. The first officer, drawn out from the cockpit by the commotion, arrived at last. He was younger, his face pale but composed, his uniform crisp. He froze when he saw the captain on the floor, struggling against the attendants, and Ronda standing like an immovable pillar beside him. For a heartbeat, he looked uncertain, caught between loyalty to his superior and the undeniable reality of what had unfolded. But when his eyes shifted to the woman in the seat, her tear-streaked face, and her trembling form, the choice became clear. He squared his shoulders, took a deep breath, and spoke with quiet authority. "I am assuming command of this flight," he said. "Captain Harris is relieved of duty." The cabin erupted in murmurs. Relief washed over the passengers, and though some still looked nervous, many allowed themselves to smile, to exhale, to feel that justice was finally being restored. The captain's face twisted with fury, his pride wounded deeper than any physical blow. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice cracking under strain. "I will have your career destroyed for this." But the first officer's expression did not waver. "You have endangered the safety and dignity of a passenger. You struck her. You abused your authority. This flight will continue under my command, and upon landing, you will be escorted from this aircraft." His voice was steady, firm, and though it trembled slightly with the weight of defying a superior, it carried conviction that silenced further protest. Passengers broke into applause again, louder this time, and the sound rolled through the cabin like a wave. The businessman who had once remained silent now clapped with vigor, his face alight with approval. The woman across the aisle, who had covered her mouth in horror earlier, clapped through tears, her shoulders shaking with relief. Even those in economy joined in, their applause echoing forward like thunder. The captain's reign of intimidation had crumbled, and the collective voice of those he had scorned rose in triumphant solidarity. The attendants lifted him at last, restraining him not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, their movements careful yet unyielding. They guided him back toward the rear of the cabin, where he could be contained until the plane made its descent. His head hung low now, his voice reduced to muttering threats that carried no power. Every step he took was observed, every eye fixed on him, and the humiliation was complete. Meanwhile, Ronda turned to the pregnant woman, her expression softening for the first time since she had risen from her seat. She crouched beside her, her strong frame bending, close to meet the woman's trembling gaze. "You're safe now," she said gently, her voice stripped of steel, filled instead with warmth. "No one will touch you again." The woman let out a sob, her hand clutching Ronda's as though it were the only anchor she had left in the world. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from tears. You don't know what you've done for me." Ronda's eyes softened further. "I know what it's like to be cornered, to feel powerless, and I know what it means when someone finally stands beside you. Tonight, that's all I could do. Stand beside you." The exchange brought more tears to nearby passengers, their hearts stirred not only by the confrontation they had witnessed, but by the quiet humanity in its aftermath. They had seen power abused, and then they had seen strength used to protect rather than to destroy. It was a lesson none of them would forget. The first officer returned to the cabin and addressed the passengers with steady calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet, "we have had an incident tonight that has been handled. Please know that your safety and comfort are my highest priorities for the remainder of this flight. We will be making an unscheduled landing to ensure proper procedures are followed, and authorities will meet us upon arrival. Thank you for your patience." The announcement was met not with groans or complaints, but with nods of understanding and murmurs of approval. The passengers, having borne witness to something extraordinary, trusted this new voice of authority. The attendants moved with renewed purpose, offering water and tissues, comforting those who still looked shaken, checking on the pregnant woman with genuine care. As order settled back into the cabin, passengers began to speak more openly. A man leaned across the aisle to another and said, "She saved us all tonight. Can you imagine if no one had stood up?" A young woman clasped her hands together and whispered, "I'll never forget this. Never." Conversation sparked, weaving through the rows, and at the center of it all sat Ronda, who returned quietly to her seat in economy, refusing the repeated offers from attendants to move her forward again. She had not done this for comfort or recognition, and she would not accept it now. Still, the gratitude of the passengers followed her. A child waved shyly from 2 rows ahead, his mother mouthing "thank you" with eyes shining. The businessman reached out as she passed him on her way back, squeezing her hand firmly with wordless respect. Even the young attendant, tears drying on her cheeks, whispered, "I'll never forget this, ma'am. Never." The pregnant woman leaned back in her seat once more, though this time her posture was different. She was no longer curled inward in fear or humiliation. She sat taller, her hand on her belly, her face illuminated by the soft cabin light, as though carrying not just her child, but the weight of a newfound dignity. She had been struck, humiliated, degraded, and then defended, protected, restored. The memory of cruelty would linger, but so too would the memory of justice, carved forever into her heart. As the plane cut through the night sky, heading toward its unscheduled landing, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Fear had given way to solidarity, humiliation to triumph. The captain who had once dominated with arrogance now sat contained and powerless, while the woman he had scorned was treated with the dignity she deserved. And at the heart of it all was the figure who had chosen to act when silence had become unbearable. The story was not yet finished. There would be questions, investigations, consequences that rippled beyond the cabin walls. But in that moment, high above the earth, justice had been delivered, not by rank, not by wealth, not by uniform, but by the courage of one woman who refused to look away. And as the passengers settled once more into their seats, hearts still pounding with the remnants of adrenaline, they knew this flight would never be forgotten. For they had seen strength used not to dominate, but to defend. And in that revelation, they found hope. The night sky stretched endlessly beyond the cabin windows, the stars distant and cold against the black velvet expanse. But inside the aircraft, the air was alive with something altogether human. It pulsed with the lingering tension of what had unfolded, with the hum of voices sharing their disbelief, with the murmurs of passengers replaying every detail of the confrontation. The captain who once strutted through the aisles had been reduced to silence, sitting guarded and disgraced in the rear, while the command of the flight had shifted firmly to the first officer. The balance of power had been restored, yet the echoes of what had transpired reverberated through every row, shaping a story that none aboard would ever forget. The pregnant woman who had borne the brunt of the humiliation now sat cradled in the comfort of the first-class seat, as though it had finally become her rightful place. She no longer hunched inward in shame or fear. Instead, she sat straighter, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes brighter than before. She rested her hand on her belly, and there was something fierce and unbroken in her expression now. A quiet fire lit by the knowledge that she had not been left alone. She had been struck, yes, but she had also been defended in a way that would remain with her forever. Her child, she thought, would one day hear this story, would know that even in a world capable of cruelty, there existed courage powerful enough to confront it. Around her, passengers whispered stories to each other, their voices weaving into a tapestry of collective memory. A woman told her husband in hushed tones that she had never seen bravery like that before, that she would carry the sight of it with her always. A businessman who had once looked down into his laptop as though numbers mattered more than people, confessed to the woman beside him that he had been ashamed not to stand up himself. And somewhere farther back, a child whispered in awe to his mother, asking if the woman who had fought the captain was a superhero. The mother smiled through tears, brushing his hair with a trembling hand, and replied, "Something like that." Rhonda had returned to her seat in economy, but her presence radiated through the cabin, even in silence. Passengers turned their heads, eyes filled with gratitude, some too timid to speak, others whispering thanks as she passed them by. She accepted each one with a nod, without flourish or pride, as though what she had done were the simplest, most natural thing in the world. Yet for those around her, it was more than simple, it was transformative. They had seen strength used not to dominate but to defend, and the image was seared into their minds with the weight of a parable. The attendants moved now with renewed energy, their professionalism sharpened by the knowledge that their silent hesitation had nearly left injustice unchecked. The young woman who had earlier failed to intervene found herself pausing by Rhonda's seat, her eyes glistening as she leaned close. Her voice was low, thick with emotion. "I should have said something sooner," she confessed, her throat tight. "I let fear stop me. But watching you showed me what courage looks like. I'll never forget it." Ronda looked up at her eyes soft despite the steel they had carried only minutes earlier. "We all have moments where fear wins," she said quietly. "What matters is what we do next time. If you see someone being bullied again, don't look away. That's all I ask. Be the one who stands up." "Mature no. The words struck the attendant with such force that she had to blink back fresh tears. She nodded fiercely, as though sealing a promise, before moving on with her duties, her spine straighter, her steps firmer. As the flight continued through the night, passengers gradually settled, though sleep was scarce. Conversations lingered, glances were exchanged, and more than once the quiet was broken by a ripple of subdued applause when someone replayed the moment on their phone screen, the video already spreading among them like wildfire. In the grainy glow of those recordings, Ronda's decisive intervention replayed again and again. The captain's arrogance immortalized, his fall recorded, the defense of the pregnant woman captured for the world beyond the plane. Hours later, when the plane finally descended toward its unscheduled landing, the atmosphere was one of nervous anticipation. The city lights glittered below, and the runway approached with a steady inevitability. The first officer's voice filled the cabin, calm and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be touching down shortly. Authorities will meet us on arrival. Please remain seated until we are safely at the gate. Thank you for your cooperation and for your courage tonight." When the wheels touched the ground and the plane slowed with a shuddering roar, a wave of relief swept through the passengers. They had been suspended in a world of tension, but now the end had come into view. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, police officers and security personnel were already visible through the windows, their presence stark and undeniable. The disgraced captain was escorted off first. He shuffled down the aisle under the weight of countless eyes, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed. The passengers did not cheer now. They watched in heavy silence, their condemnation more powerful than any jeer. He muttered threats still, promises of retribution, but his words fell into the void, powerless and ignored. For all his arrogance, he left the plane a broken figure, and his downfall was complete. The pregnant woman was next to rise, though this time she was not trembling. She stood tall, supported by passengers who offered her steadying hands, her face lit by gratitude. When she turned toward Ronda, she hesitated, then crossed the aisle despite her exhaustion. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she reached for Ronda's hand, holding it tightly. "You gave me back my dignity," she said softly. "I'll carry that for the rest of my life, and so will my child." Ronda's expression softened, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "Take care of yourself," she said simply. "Take care of both of you. That's all that matters now." When she finally stepped off the plane, Ronda was greeted not with silence, but with the hushed awe of those who had witnessed something remarkable. Passengers whispered her name, some applauded again, and others reached for her hand as she passed. She accepted it all quietly, her humility a stark contrast to the storm of attention that was about to engulf her. By the time news broke beyond the terminal, the video had already begun to spread online. Within hours, it would reach millions. The story carried across continents, its images replayed endlessly. The captain's sneer, the slap, the humiliation of a woman who had done nothing wrong, and then the sudden, decisive intervention that turned the tide. The world, so often hungry for tales of downfall and disgrace, embraced instead a story of courage and justice. Headlines would call her a hero, though she never claimed the title. Commentators would debate what it meant, though for those who had been there, no explanation was necessary. The airline issued statements in the days that followed. They condemned the captain's actions, promised thorough investigation, and vowed reforms. But more than corporate words, it was the passengers' testimonies that carried the weight of truth. They told of a flight where silence had nearly allowed cruelty to triumph until one woman chose to act. They spoke of the pregnant passengers' tears, of the fear that had gripped the cabin, of the applause that broke the silence when justice was restored. And through it all, the image of Ronda endured, not as a fighter in the ring, not as a celebrity, but as a symbol. She became the embodiment of the truth that strength is not found in uniforms or titles, nor in wealth or arrogance, but in the willingness to stand for what is right. For the pregnant woman, the memory became more than just a story. It was a promise she whispered to her child each night as she felt them stir inside her, that the world, though harsh, still held protectors, still held guardians, still held people willing to fight, not for themselves but for others, and in that promise she found hope. The story of Flight 762 lived on long after the plane had landed, long after the passengers had scattered back to their separate lives. It became a tale retold at dinner tables, shared in classrooms, debated in newsrooms, passed like a parable from one generation to another. It was proof that justice could arrive even at 30,000 feet, that humanity could shine even in the smallest acts, that one voice raised against cruelty could inspire a chorus. And for those who had been there, who had felt the silence in the storm, it was more than a story. It was a transformation. They had boarded as strangers, but they left bound together by the memory of a moment when courage changed everything. In the end, the lesson lingered not in the humiliation of the captain, but in the simple truth etched into the hearts of those who witnessed it, that the true measure of wealth is not found in titles or tickets, but in character. And that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand and say enough to remind the world what justice really looks like. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. There are plenty more unbelievable stories waiting for you. Click right here to watch the next video and dive into even more shocking twists you won't believe actually happened. And if this one gave you chills, share it with your friends and see their reactions too, because some stories are just too powerful to keep to yourself.